Welcome to Speak English with Class. Learn English through real conversations.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we're going inside the machine. We're looking at a process that happens silently, continuously, and usually unconsciously inside the mind of every single person trying to learn a new language. We are looking at the text, The Compassionate Voice of Language Learning, and specifically that internal civil war that really dictates whether a learner succeeds or just quits.
Right, and it's a war between two very specific combatants. The text frames this as a conflict between the judge, this critical negative voice, and the teacher, a more compassionate, calmer voice. You know, it sounds like a simple fable, but the implications for performance are they're quite profound.
Exactly. And the central question we're wrestling with today is, it's a question of strategy. Does true progress in a complex skill like English require a compassionate, gentle inner voice that prioritizes just the act of trying over the need for perfection? Or, on the other hand, does mastery demand a critical, rigorous standard, a voice that identifies errors and refuses to accept mediocrity?
It is that classic tension, isn't it, between psychological safety and performance standards. The text, it clearly takes a side. It argues the judge is a barrier to be dismantled. I am approaching this with a pretty significant degree of skepticism, though, about the utility of gentleness as a primary learning strategy. My concern, which we'll unpack, is whether silencing the critical voice actually removes the quality control mechanism necessary for competence. You know, if you remove the critique, do you remove the incentive to improve?
And I'm taking the position that the text has correctly identified the single biggest hurdle in language acquisition. And it's not intellectual capacity, it's not grammar knowledge, but psychological paralysis. The text argues that progress happens only when the learner is, quote, kind to themselves. And before you roll your eyes at the word kind, the text defines this as being patient and gentle. So my stance is that the rigorous standard you value so much is completely useless if the learner is too afraid to even open their mouth. We're debating whether this calmer voice is a soft option or if it is, in fact, the only viable mechanism for survival in the learning process.
Survival is a dramatic word, but let's test it. Let's look at the reality of that internal monologue. The text opens with a premise that I think we can both accept, which is, inside your mind there are voices, not one voice. Many voices.
Right. And it describes a scenario that I think every single listener has felt. You're in a conversation, you have a thought, you want to express it, but as you form the sentence, you realize the grammar isn't perfect. Maybe you can't find the right preposition, or you're not sure about the tense.
You spot a flaw. The internal monitoring system kicks in.
And that is when the negative voice speaks. The text quotes it explicitly. Stop, you sound stupid. It's so aggressive. It says don't speak. And the text argues that if you believe this voice, you become quiet and you feel small. Now, my position is that this sensation, this shrinking, is the death knell of learning. The only way to finish the sentence, to actually stay in the interaction, is to actively amplify that second, quieter voice, the one that says, it's okay, say it anyway. I mean, the text defines to learn quite beautifully as to change little by little. It does not mean to be perfect. If we don't accept that definition, we stop speaking entirely.
I don't disagree that total paralysis is counterproductive, of course. If you never speak, you certainly never learn. However, I want to challenge the immediate demonization of that first voice. The text quotes the negative voice saying things like, "My English is not good," or "I make too many mistakes." We have to look at this objectively. Sometimes those statements are factual. They're data points.
But are they helpful data points in the moment of speaking?
Well, they can be. If a learner is making too many mistakes, pausing to reflect or even just feeling a degree of dissatisfaction is a natural feedback loop. It's a signal to recalibrate. The text labels this persona the judge who punishes. I just think that is a very, very harsh interpretation of what could simply be an editor or a quality control manager. So my position is that while listening to the compassionate voice is necessary for confidence, it is totally insufficient for competence if it results in just ignoring critical feedback. Simply saying I am learning shouldn't become a shield against the reality of poor performance.
I see why you'd frame it as quality control, but I think you're underestimating the paralyzing power of that so-called editor. Let's look at the first core theme of our debate, the mechanism of action, specifically this choice between stopping and continuing. The text offers a very specific flowchart of what happens in the brain.
Okay, walk us through the mechanism.
You hesitate. The voice says don't speak. The text explicitly states that progress happens only when you bypass that hesitation. It's not about ignoring data. It's about the functional definition of a mistake. The text reminds us, every fluent speaker made mistakes in the past. Therefore, the act of speaking with errors is functionally superior to the act of silence. The negative voice halts the mechanism. It stops the assembly line. The compassionate voice keeps the machine running.
But does the machine produce anything of value if it's running on broken gears? The text advises, say it anyway. It's okay. I worry about the implications of that specific instruction. If the inner voice says stop because the grammar is fundamentally broken, let's say you're using the wrong tense entirely, that stop might be a signal to self-correct. It's not just a signal of shame, it's a signal of syntax.
But the correction can't happen if the sentence isn't spoken. You cannot edit a blank page.
But if we blindly follow the advice to say it anyway, are we encouraging the fossilization of errors? This is a known phenomenon in linguistics. I mean, if you repeat a mistake enough times without correction, it becomes permanent. Is practicing really valuable if you are practicing the wrong thing repeatedly just because you've told yourself it's okay to be wrong?
I think you're conflating ignoring errors with ignoring the shame of errors. The text doesn't say pretend you are perfect. In fact, it explicitly says you can say I made a mistake and continue speaking. The key here is the continuation. If you stop because the judge says you sound stupid, you lose the opportunity to receive external feedback from the person you're talking to. The internal judge shuts down the external feedback loop. The calmer voice allows the learner to put the imperfect sentence out into the world where it can actually be corrected by a listener rather than just criticized by the self.
Well, that assumes the learner is receptive to correction after they've just convinced themselves that I am allowed to be a beginner. But let's look at the definitions provided in the text, because this is our second theme, and I think this is where the text gets, well, quite radical. It effectively rewrites the dictionary for the learner.
It reframes the vocabulary, yes. It takes words that carry a lot of weight and softens them to make them usable.
Softens is one word for it. It defines kind as patient and gentle. It defines to try as to continue even when it is difficult. You view this as essential reframing. I view it as potentially lowering the bar to a dangerous degree.
I wouldn't say it lowers the bar. I would say it makes the bar clearable. Kindness isn't about being soft, it's about being practical. The text states to improve means to become better over time, not quickly, not suddenly. This addresses the unrealistic expectations that fuel that negative voice. If a learner expects to be perfect now, they will quit. If they adopt the text's definition that improvement is slow and that, stagnation is often just invisible progress, they have the stamina to keep going. If you aren't kind, you quit. And if you quit, the rigorous standards you value so much become completely irrelevant because you aren't studying anymore.
But look at the definition of a voice provided in the text. It says it is not a real sound, but it feels real. It suggests we can just choose to tune it out. But if that voice says, I will never speak like a native, okay, that might be an exaggeration, an emotional attack. But if the voice says, I make too many mistakes, that is a measurable metric. By categorizing all critical internal dialogue as just a feeling rather than a real sound, we risk dismissing objective reality. Slow progress is fine, but as I said, sometimes slow progress is actually just no progress disguised as patience. The text says, I am improving, even if the progress feels slow. How does the learner know they're improving if they've silenced the voice that tracks their errors?
They know they are improving because they are still engaging with the language. The text emphasizes, little by little, your ears change, your brain changes. And this leads us right to the central metaphor of the text, the teacher versus the judge. This is the heart of the debate.
This is the core dichotomy, yes.
The text says, a teacher explains, a judge punishes. This distinction is vital. A judge mindset I am bad at English, is described as a heavy sentence that closes the door. It is a final verdict. You are bad, case closed. A teacher mindset keeps the process open. It says, I don't understand, yes, but I will understand later. It answers the negative voice rather than fighting it. It keeps the door open for future data.
Okay, I accept the metaphor, but I think the text presents a false dichotomy. Any academic knows that a good teacher judges performance constantly. Assessment is part of teaching. A teacher doesn't just pat you on the back. If the calmer voice, the teacher, only ever says, I am learning or I am allowed to be a beginner, every time a mistake is made, does the learner ever feel the urgency to fix the grammar?
The urgency comes from the desire to communicate, not from the fear of punishment.
But does it? The text warns against the judge who punishes, and I agree, punishment is bad pedagogy. But the text seems to advocate for a teacher who only offers reassurance. You do not need to fight the negative voice, it says. You only need to notice it and answer with a calmer one. If the answer is always a soft affirmation, we risk creating a participation trophy mentality where the effort of trying replaces the result of succeeding. You need a teacher who says, that was wrong, do it again, not just, that was brave.
I think you're mischaracterizing the teacher in the text. The teacher isn't just giving out gold stars. The teacher is providing a realistic timeline. And this brings us to the power of yet, which I believe is the strongest argument in the source material. The text suggests changing I am not good at English to I am not good at English yet.
Yet.
Yes. This isn't a participation trophy. It's a statement of potentiality. Yet means not now but later. It means your story is not finished. This word bridges the gap between the current reality, which you admit is imperfect, and the future goal. It acknowledges the lack of skill now, without condemning the learner's entire identity. It transforms a statement of failure into a statement of planning. I don't understand this yet is a very different psychological state than I don't understand this.
I will concede that yet is a powerful linguistic tool. I agree with the text when it calls sentences with yet honest. I can't speak fluently yet is a factual statement. It doesn't deny the lack of fluency. However, yet implies that work must be done. It is not a magic word. You cannot simply say, I am not fluent yet, and then just wait for fluency to arrive in the mail.
Of course not.
But the text notes, little by little, your ears change, your brain changes. That implies a biological adaptation, a neuroplastic change. That change comes from the struggle. The text defines to try as to continue even when it is difficult. My point is that the judge or the critical voice is often the source of the pressure that makes us engage with the difficult part. If we are too comfortable, if the teacher is too gentle, do we ever trigger that biological change? Don't we need friction to create heat?
But the text argues that the pressure you speak of is often what breaks the machine before the heat can be generated. You mentioned biology. The text says confidence grows not by force, not by pressure, but by repetition, by patience. If the pressure is too high, the learner stops repeating. So I maintain that the primary obstacle to language learning is emotional regulation. By adopting the compassionate voice, using words like yet, and viewing mistakes as part of learning, the learner stays in the game long enough for biology to take over. You can't force the brain to change faster by yelling at it. You can only provide the environment, repetition, and exposure where it can change. The teacher provides that environment. The judge destroys it.
And I maintain that while the environment needs to be safe, it also needs to be rigorous. While the judge shouldn't paralyze you, the teacher shouldn't lie to you. We need an inner voice that is kind enough to keep us speaking, but sharp enough to catch errors. The text says, I understand more than I think. That is a lovely sentiment, but sometimes you don't understand, and you need a voice that says, I don't understand this, and I need to go study it, rather than just, it's okay, I'm learning. There's a very fine line between patience and passivity.
I think the text addresses that balance in its conclusion, specifically regarding the ebb and flow of energy. It says, there will be days when you feel motivated and days when you feel tired. This acknowledges that the learner isn't a robot. On those tired days, the rigorous approach you advocate for is almost guaranteed to fail.
Why is that?
Because willpower is a finite resource. If you are exhausted and your inner voice starts criticizing your grammar, you will quit for the day. You might quit for the week. The text argues that on tired days, your inner voice matters even more. And on those days, the only successful strategy is my approach. Today is not perfect, but I am still learning.
I can agree with that distinction. Context matters. On a day of high energy, perhaps you invite the editor in to scrutinize your work. You push for that high standard. On a tired day, you rely on the teacher just to keep you moving. The text concludes with the phrase, "and that is enough." Perhaps that is the synthesis here. Sometimes simply maintaining the habit, even imperfectly, is enough to bridge the gap to the next day. The ultimate rigor might actually be the patience required to accept imperfect days without quitting.
Exactly. The text suggests that the teacher is actually the ultimate form of discipline because it demands the hardest thing of all, not perfection, but persistence in the face of imperfection. It asks you to look at your mistakes and say, I am allowed to be a beginner, and then just do it again tomorrow. It's all about longevity.
It leaves us with a provocative thought. The text asks the reader to observe. When you study English, do you speak to yourself like a teacher or like a judge? It really is a question of utility. Which voice actually gets you to the finish line? I would argue you need both, but you need to know which one is holding the microphone at any given time.
And that is a question every listener has to answer for themselves in the privacy of their own mind. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Until next time.